Okay, guys, we have a lot to unpack. This week we had the Mueller report come out, at least a summary of it, and that has sent everybody spinning. I will try to make some sense in it. I know there's so much other things that are important, and especially issues of the extinction and global warming, but I do feel that our democracy is really crucial in order to address any of this in a successful way. If we let our democracy run away, we won't be able to have any impact on global climate change or anything like that. So I do find it very important to address those issues. So Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has released a short letter, uh, pretty much specifying that there was no findings of conspiracy on the part of Trump in regards to cooperating with Russia. But he has not exonerated Trump in any way from obstruction. Apparently, there was evidence in the Mueller report regarding obstruction, but they have not made a complete determination whether these were 100% evidence or that they're impeachable matter. However, it is extremely important to make a few points. And that is, first of all, it turns out that the Mueller report was extremely laser focused on the issue of the conspiracy with Russians. And though there was no evidence, it's not a proof or exoneration either that that did not occur. However, there has not been any proof that could be found regarding Trump coordinating with Russians before the elections. Apparently, he has not looked into other important things, and these accusations were actually the ones that Team Trump has highlighted. Once the Mueller report was launched, he came out yelling, there has not been any collusion with the Russians. But the main accusations at the time, the main questions were actually about him having reduced the sanctions on the Russians once he took office to profit himself. And the question was he being bribed? And there are apparently some things that point to that in public record that have been reported on. But apparently this has not been at all the focus of the Mueller report. So that by itself is an impeachable offense. If Trump has accepted bribes so that he would reduce the sanctions on Russia based on the fact that they were interfering with our elections, and that has been proven, and that is in the report and was a conclusion that the Russians indeed have meddled with US elections, then that is an impeachable offense. It would be a high crime. But again, this has not been at all the focus. And some blame Democrats that they have kind of zeroed in on that part of the investigation because it was feeding into the narrative of the Democrats not having lost the elections due to presenting a flawed candidate, which was Hillary Clinton, but rather that for some reason Russians were able to subvert our elections to get Trump elected. And I can see in a little bit of a point in that because the elections came close, but why were they close? They shouldn't have even been close. If the Democratic Party had a decent president candidate, they would have easily beaten Trump. So that may have been part of the reason why there was focus on this aspect, and that kind of messed things up because now Democrats trying to look at the other things that were not investigated by the Mueller investigation may appear to the general public as pettiness or witch hunt or sore losers approach, but in fact there are many questions, and I've all along been saying, why not start impeachment proceedings on the issues that we knew existed? And there were a lot of them, rather than wait for the Mueller investigation, because everything was kind of hitched on the fact that Mueller would come up with some smoking gun and that would incriminate Trump beyond. It would be an easier impeachment if he indeed was proven to have colluded with Russians to subvert our elections. But that may have not occurred. I take Mueller's word that he has investigated as closely as possible. But let's also remember that we have only seen a summary of the summary of Mueller. We have not even seen the full Mueller summary. So looking just at the summary where Mueller makes the determination whether there was altogether enough to prosecute without any reasonable doubt, already reduces it to a binary kind of form, either yes or no. And in fact, if he exposed 50, 60, 80% likelihood that that has occurred, but was not able to determine it without a reasonable doubt, that has not come out in the report summary, and neither in the summary to the summary, which was a really brief statement by William Barr. So we don't really even know if there was other things. Now, the other important thing is that William Barr did discuss the findings of Mueller, but Mueller has spun off many other investigations into the district courts. So, for example, there is a district court in New York that is dealing with the hush money that was provided to Stormy Daniels and to another person that he had an affair with, that Trump had an affair with. And that may by itself also constitute a high crime because it involved campaign funding, which may have crossed the laws about campaign finance. So that's one thing that's going on. There is another one where the interaction between Deutsche Bank and loans that Trump applied for and got based on false, fraudulent appraisals of his properties. It came out that he has understated his property values for tax purposes, and then for the same properties he inflated the values in order to get insurance for them. So those are insurance fraud and tax fraud. These may not be impeachable, but certainly those are things that he may be charged and indicted for, maybe not during his office, which is still remaining to be seen, but certainly once he's out of the White House. And also he's investigated in other courts about the his charitable foundation, whether he's plunged into it and enriched himself. There's another issue of the Trump Tower and the fact that that might have been an issue actually that was not looked into by the Mueller investigation, but should have been. And that is whether he was rewarded in some way by Russians for lowering sanctions, and that remains to be seen. There's also the inaugural fund and probably fraud. So all of these things are like spun off. I think there's like over 20 of these uh, spin-off investigations in local courts, and that might be even worse news for Trump, who's presenting it now as in a victory lap as being vindicated. However, these things might be little time bombs because they will start exploding all on their own, kind of like little dynamite sticks that are being swallowed by the shark and then go off on their own. It's going to be very difficult for him because if that happens, there is no way for him to control this. This would be in multiple locations, multiple states. He would have very little effect on it as opposed to the federal level where he could still do some monkey business by pressuring an AG, an attorney general, or doing all kinds of other things to obstruct. When it comes to states, that's not the case. So I predict that this is not the end of all of this, and these investigations are going to be continuing on their own, even though maybe not in this high-profile fashion that the Mueller investigation was. And I'm wondering if that is even something that he did on purpose, knowing that he probably received a lot of headwind for his investigation and figured that that was a better way to approach it. So in no way has Trump yet been vindicated or exonerated. He has been exonerated on a very specific slice, and that is whether he has collaborated with Russians before the elections to interfere. So this is not the end. I know that the public is tired, and I know that a lot of people keep saying, well, this is the proof. There's nothing in it. There wasn't anything to it. But the truth is a little more complex. And, well, it's unfortunate that we as a country have to go through it, but in order to protect our democracy, it is really important to not allow abuse of power, because if we let that happen and we let even the president step above the law, that is a very, very dangerous precedent. So I agree with those on the left, some progressives that oppose the idea of hyper-focusing on the collusion thing. I think the issues are much broader with this president, but I don't think he should be let off the hook. I'm sorry. So that is about the investigation. I'm sure you're tired of hearing about it, but I felt that it was important enough to focus on and really expand on. On a sadder note, I wanted to talk a little bit about suicide by a student that survived the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting on Valentine's Day of last year. There were 17 kids killed at that time, and that launched a protest movement by the students to change the gun laws, which apparently up to this moment has been unsuccessful. But they're vowing to be involved in the upcoming elections, and I hope they do, because this issue is extremely important. We're unable to make any changes to our gun laws, even logical ones, such as not having people who are on the terrorist list have guns, or people with mental disabilities having guns. We're just not able to move in that direction. But this student, Sydney Aiello, just committed suicide now, a year later. And it's extremely sad. This is, I think, post-traumatic experiences of children from shootings are just it's just heartbreaking. And it's infuriating in that perspective that nothing has been done. Nothing has been done. And this just highlights and reminds us of this in the midst of everything else that is going on. We're looking at a place like New Zealand where there is a mass shooting and immediately they enforce more sensible gun laws. Well, in our case, we wouldn't even dream of enacting the type of laws that New Zealand has, but it just makes perfect sense to look at ways to reduce the effect of guns in the public. And I'm sorry, guns do kill. It's people with guns. And I hope something is done about it eventually. It's tragic that we're going through these mass shootings one after the other, and we don't have the sense to stop it. And now Venezuela. Okay, so Trump met with Brazil's Prime Minister Bolsonaro, and he was asked whether the U.S. is considering military action against Venezuela, and he said all options are open. So there is speculation that this has indeed been part of his conversation with the Brazilian leader, who is pretty much a replica, another one of Trump's replicas, a very outspoken, fascistly oriented personality. And the question is whether he's considering attacking Venezuela with partnership by Brazil. It's pretty clear, and the Trump administration has not been very smart to hide it, as previous administrations may have done in terms of interest in South American parties in South American countries. The Trump administration has clearly stated, and Bolton has clearly stated that they wanted American oil companies to see profits from Venezuelan oil. They see it as an area that has not been tapped. And so the question is, are they going to invade Venezuela to oust President Nicolás Maduro? Now, it is quite clear that the interest of this administration is not the humanitarian aspect, because they have in fact placed an embargo on Venezuela, hoping that that would cause military desertion from supporting the government, but that hasn't happened. And so they have in fact worsened the humanitarian crisis that's going on in Venezuela due to mishandling of the economy by the Maduro regime. But either way, that's their reasoning for pushing Juan Guaido, who is the opposition leader, to pronounce himself as the de facto president of Venezuela. Now, if the US was really worried about the welfare of the people, they would have not placed an embargo and caused it even to deteriorate further. And then it's quite ridiculous that then they have been sending convoys of aid marked as US aid instead of letting the Red Cross deliver them, in a way to cause trouble for the Maduro government. Naturally, the Maduro government rejected those convoys. Research into military intervention in the past has shown that in most cases, aside from in the case of Japan and Germany after Second World War, they were not as poor and not as diverse as the Latin American countries. And the US has been able to do something called external monitored installation. And that is a term that refers to an installation of a democratic country after an authoritarian country regime is toppled. But that required a large Marshall Plan and US intervention for a long time. In the case of South America, all previous historic precedences have not resulted in a democracy after a military intervention, perhaps with the only exception, as far as I know, of Panama, which kind of got a democracy, corrupt one, but still a democracy. But it was a much smaller country, and basically the US was very enmeshed in it to begin with. So it's not a good example. But all the other examples lead to the fact that these countries devolved into an autocratic regime that was of the opposite kind of the one that was toppled. So in the case of Venezuela, what we would probably expect is a right-wing totalitarian regime led by the current opposition. It would bolster the economic elites and give, again, use the military as a leverage. So probably maybe with a change of personnel and leadership, it would bolster the military and prioritize them to the general population. But I doubt, and many experts doubt, that it will result in a democracy. And for that reason, it would be foolish to attempt an invasion. Attempt an invasion with Brazil is a complete mess and complete disaster. And that is something that will cause such a huge, complicated mess, a hot mess in the future if that actually occurs. Because now we're talking about geopolitical issues and animosity, and we're not looking at the pretty picture even after the US pulls out and just exploits the natural resources with the help of replacement government. I hope this doesn't happen, and I really hope that there's enough people in the US that call the representatives and press on this issue, because having the US involved in yet another such regime change disaster would just not be a good thing. We've meddled long enough with, caused a lot of animosity in other countries, and those are our neighbors, so to speak. So that is an issue that concerns me at the moment. Hopefully we'll see it evolve into a democratic election rather, and I don't have a problem with the opposition being supported in various ways, but I do not consider military intervention to be a good idea. In general, I think there should be a school for democracy, and my friend Troy Davis has championed that idea, and we've really spent a lot of time with evolving science in areas such as behavioral sciences and chemistry and nuclear physics and so forth. We have never really focused on democracy. And what is it that makes a country turn into a democracy versus evolve into chaos like Libya has. Until we crack that, we are not going to have a good success with any of our interventions, whether they're justified in terms of humanitarian intervention or not. The fact is that if they cause a worse scenario of a totalitarian regime after intervention, it is detrimental, and that is something that Tulsi Gabbard, who's running for president at the moment, is highlighting very much. I don't think she's considering research and development of the idea of spreading democracy. I think she's just concerned about extracting the U.S. from such wars. But I think that if we had a good answer, that would be a desirable thing. If we knew what to do to actually improve people's lives in areas of the world that are suffering, that would not be a bad thing. Okay, and we've come to the end of our show today. Next section, I will talk about Jared Kushner and his involvement with his brother's business. They're a business sharing of 50-50% that apparently is enforced in their businesses, and there's now evidence that sprung out that while Kushner was meeting with Saudis on political issues, his brother was meeting with his business partners. Interesting. This is yet to come. This is could be explosive, and we will monitor that and talk about it in our next show. All right. So if you like the content of this show, if you enjoyed the conversation, please share. Please subscribe. You can subscribe in your favorite podcast app, or you can go to YouTube, subscribe, and also ring the bell so you're notified. Don't forget to ring the bell. That's important. That's the bell next to the subscribe button. And if you want to talk to me or raise issues, questions, or topics that you want covered, just tweet with the hashtag #ProgressiveUpdate. Okay, till next time. Bye-bye.